Welcome back to the second panel of the Moving Objects Symposium. I am delighted that I get the privilege of introducing our moderator for this panel. Krishnendu Ray is a professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at NYU. He is the author of The Migrant's Table and The Ethnic Restaurateur, and the co-editor of Curried Cultures, Globalization, Food in South Asia, and Practicing Food Studies. I met Krishnendu because he was a delightful co-editor of Verge 9.2, which was a special issue on culinary cultures on the move. His most recent pieces theorize touching food in the digital age, and Krishnendu has very kindly agreed to be the moderator for this afternoon's panel, which is People Moving Objects. So I'd love for you to join me in welcoming both Krishnendu and the panelists for this second panel, Kyoungjin Bae, Eve Oishi, and Alicia Elizabeth Cherian.
Hey, hi everyone, welcome. Good to see you in this inside a building on this gorgeous day. I'm going to quickly introduce each of the speakers and then go in the sequence, and I might say something or I will open it up to the audience and see how it goes. Is of course Moving Objects, Modes of Conveyance and Making of Global Asia. And our first presenter is Kyoungjin Bae, is an assistant professor of Chinese history in the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And her research interests include early modern crafts, technology, material culture, and traditional Chinese history. Transnational. Traditional would be funny, no? If I use that. Transnational Chinese history. She's currently completing a book manuscript titled Skills Across Borders, Translocal Cantonese Woodwork During Qing Dynasty, which examines artisanal movements between Canton, Beijing, and the Indian Ocean during the 18th and 19th centuries, with skill as its central analytical lens.
So the subject of my presentation is related to one of the global Asian commodities, which is tea, which is, by and large, China, Japan, and India is the largest producers of tea right now. But I'm not going to talk about tea. I'm actually going to talk about the tea container. And it will be about people moving objects that moves people as well. So in 1866, Edward Fisher Bamber, who was an English engineer, picked up tea chests as a subject of conversation after visiting tea plantations in Bengal and Assam. It's a bit of a convoluted quote, but bear with me. He says, quote, "The Calcutta agents and almost everyone who has anything to do with them find faults with tea boxes. It is useless for those planters who send their tea for the sale to the Calcutta market to say that they don't care about it after it has reached its destination and been sold, and equally useless is it for those who ship tea to England to say, to try to excuse their bad boxes." So this brings to our attention an overlooked object in the history of global tea trade, which is tea chests, or in their own words, tea boxes. While much scholarship has examined tea as a commodity of global significance with its ties to early modern silver flow, plantation economies, and the Opium War, few noticed the importance of packing chests that enabled the very movement of tea. Both historical sources and contemporary scholars say that tea and not tea chest moved from one place to another, just as we often say your order, right? Not its packing box, shipped from one place to your door. So this is because tea chests were intermediate goods, just like today's cardboard shipping boxes, which become imperceptible. I think there was a beautiful word that came out this morning, invisible, hard, infrastructural object that became sort of went under radar when it was routinized commodity circulation of tea happened. Nevertheless, it is obvious that tea did not move by itself, and it could not become a global commodity without its containers. So what then did a tea chest look like? What you're seeing here is a tea chest from the late 19th century, which I bought from eBay, because no museums collect and display tea chests. This one's made in China. So it is a rectangular wooden crate covered with a lid, as you can see in this photo. Before the early 20th century, when plywood was adopted, the chest was made with slats of solid wood, which were lined internally with sheets of metal liner, which is often lead alloy. After the tea was packed, these metal seams were soldered, lid was nailed, and the exterior was labeled with production information. And you can see here the production information is shown in one side, and the other side is kind of beautifully decorated. The relatively straightforward method of chest making enabled its mass production in early modern China, the only tea exporter until the early 19th century. Nonetheless, the importance of packing chests for the tea trade became tangible only when they failed to function reliably in mid-19th century India. Many broken, rotten, and irregular chests challenged the grand ambition of the nascent British colonial industry to compete with China in the global market. So complaints from pundits and inspectors revealed that it was the materiality of chests that was at the root of the problem. As Indian Tea Gazette summarized in 1880, there's some excerpts here. Quote, many packages arrive in London showing wide interstices due no doubt to the shrinkage of wood. Unquote. Precious tea leaves could escape the chest through these gaps. In addition, as the second quote shows, chests cased in goni, which is sort of a hemp or jute sacks, arrive generally in bad shape. Internally, any breakage of wooden package that may occur is hidden, and many arriving in London approaching the spherical in shape. Even packing an equal amount of tea, which is the most basic condition in commodity circulation, was difficult because the chests themselves were often not uniform. As a result, the very long last quote, I will read it. The sum of the packages arrived too slack and others too lightly packed. In the former case, which is, if the chest is a little too dense or the small, the contents get so shaken about it in transit that an arrival, if the chest is a little too big, that the contents get so shaken in transit that the lid canister is often found broken and shapeless and the tea loosened and out of condition. In the latter, the lids get forced and the tea more or less split and damaged because the space is too cramped. So what this shows is the importance of the tea chest as an infrastructural object, which means that when it worked properly, it enabled the circulation of tea, standardized its value, and mediated its market relations. When it did not function properly, the circulation became fractured, the commodity became depreciated, and the market became unpredictable. Significantly, this mid-century crisis drives our attention to the silent period of the first half of the 19th century when these chests were not bad and as a result attracted little attention from stakeholders. What we find in this period of silence is another layer of erasure not of objects but also of people. As historian Andrew Liu shows, colonial tea industry was a unique modern capitalist enterprise that resulted from British endeavor to reduce its reliance on Chinese tea. During the incubation period of the 1830s and 40s, the enterprise generated two contrasting yet concomitant illicit movements of people and things. First, the travel of East India Company agents such as Robert Fortune to China and as far as inland Fujian, where he was actually not supposed to be, to surreptitiously gather the seeds of the tea crop and the knowledge of their plantation and manufacture. Second, the movement of skilled Chinese labor, including tea makers, carpenters, and metalsmiths to India to help establish India's first tea plantations. While crop cultivation underwent a series of experiments with the Chinese and native plants, in terms of manufacture, the new industry fervently learned from Chinese methods from plucking, withering, and rolling to oxidizing, fire drying, and packing. Especially in packing, planters, quote, copied with meticulous exactitude the kinds of package in which China tea has been delivered, even down to the decorative and colored paper on the outside of the chest, unquote. So building such a novel industry from scratch was contingent on the transmission of the embodied knowledge of experienced artisans through the movement of their own bodies. Yet because overseas migration was not only prohibited but also unrecognized in China until 1866, when the Qing government intervened in the indentured trade, sort of labor trade with some regulation, the travel of Chinese artisans towards early Indian plantations remained largely elusive. However, we can see that the recruitment tapped diverse communities who had different sets of skills, dialects, and regional backgrounds. As early as 1836, the EICT committee hired a quote-unquote Chinese carpenter in Calcutta to go to Assam with tea makers who had just arrived from the Fujian region called Wuyi. His job was primarily, quote, making tea boxes, unquote. As I have shown elsewhere, these carpenters were from Pearl River Delta who had settled in Calcutta since the late 18th century and engaged in a variety of woodworking trades, especially in Bengal. On the other hand, metalsmiths were hired directly from Canton on fixed contracts, much like tea makers from Fujian. While many of them returned to China after their terms expired, but also many, especially carpenters, left in the tea towns as regular employees. Early documents of colonial tea production reveal that planters followed the process of Chinese chest making step by step. The extant earliest record, titled Report on the Manufacture of Tea, written by famous planter and experimenter Charles Alexander Bruce in 1840, corresponds with the clockwise sequence of the images shown here, which are produced in the late 18th century expert Chinese painting. From the top left, the metal lining maker, to the right, assembling crates, to the bottom right, the painting, and farther there, packing and labeling. So if you sort of see this as a sequence, what this image or the mid-19th century crisis implies that is that the mushrooming tea industry resulted in an increasing replacement of expensive and rare Chinese labor, which requires migration, with quote-unquote cheap and abundant indigenous labor in numerous plantations. So this image shows that it's Darjeeling, and it's kind of one of the Himalayan tribal artisans are recruited to make tea chests. So labor diversification, as well as increasing pressure of colonial capitalism towards fast and mass production of tea chests, compromised the quality of packages, even as tea production itself grew. So if you actually see, I don't know whether you can see it very well, but the kind of processes and tools that they're using to build this tea chest is pretty similar to the second image that you're seeing top here. Using slats and dovetailed at the end, and then sort of to make a crate. So initially successful transmission of tea chests from China to India and their subsequent destabilization counters sort of well-known stories or the narratives in the technology transfer where there's initial struggles and failures, and often later it becomes adaptation and localization and achieve some sort of stability. This shows that the tea chest as a portable infrastructure was a product of the intimate relationship between the materiality of chests and the knowing bodies of artisans. As in many forms of infrastructural, sort of functional infrastructure in use, this human material assembly was effective and it was invisible when it worked. But it was also unsustainable because it requires this migration of the bodies and then reproducing their knowledge on a very different environment and context. So once it became unsustainable under just industrial scale up, the tea chest emerged as a new problem of technology and labor, attracting intense colonial attention. I don't have time to talk about this further, but this sort of opened up a new landscape of tea estates in India as a new kind of global Asian landscape, where minority Chinese worked side by side with Bengalis, Nepalis, and other indentured migrants from the Indian Central Plains with new sets of opportunities and challenges. Thank you.
Okay, the next speaker is Eve. Eve Oishi is an associate professor of cultural studies at Claremont Graduate University, and their primary research interests include Asian American, transnational, queer, and experimental media art. Oishi's monograph, Partial Form, An Experimental History of Asian American Cinema, is forthcoming from Duke University Press. They are the co-editor with Jennifer Ebod of the special issue of the Journal of International Women's Studies on the practice and legacy of a Black lesbian feminist, selections from the archive of Dr. Angela Bowen, amongst others. And the title of their talk is Correspondences, 3 Missing Letters, the Postal Service, and Global Asia.
This essay considers the Postal Service as an integral yet invisible aspect of national and transnational formations. I explore this idea through the 2021 short film 3 Missing Letters by Lana Lin and H. Lantau Lan, otherwise known as the artist duo Lin plus Lam, and they are actually here in the audience with us today. So we're really lucky to have the artists, and maybe they might have better answers to some of your questions for me afterwards. Which overlaps research on mail delivery systems and philately stamp collecting in India, China, and the UK, with site-based experimental documentary practice at the site of Nathu-La, the Himalayan pass connecting India and China. The film features several real and imagined historical figures, including the postal workers who make the twice-weekly journey across the Pass of the Listening Ear on foot in often below freezing temperatures at 14,000 feet elevation to exchange bags of mail. On the Indian side, many of these postmen are Tibetan refugees whose job provides the only possible contact with their families across the border. The mail delivery system has remained a constant during the shifting tides of Sino-Indian military tensions and gradually expanding economic relations as the 2 nuclear-powered nations navigate their growing global dominance. So this paper positions both the postal system and the letters it carries as moving objects whose material and symbolic circulation produce national and local subjectivities. The postal carriers' roles as intermediaries, carrying messages they cannot read between families they cannot join, renders them subjects shaped by overlapping national, ethnic, and political identities that are contingent, suspended, and constantly negotiated. At the same time, my focus on Lan and Lim's cinematic and speculative treatment of the cross-border postal services extends the analysis of moving objects beyond the physical circulation of objects to include a consideration of forms of correspondence, exchange, and transmission, including film and video, that emerge in response to the restrictions inherent to politically and geographically dependent systems. The film's focus on undelivered and imagined letters foregrounds how breakdowns in conveyance, lost mail, restricted routes, or forbidden communication also shape subjectivity, producing forms of historical and affective imagination that link colonial infrastructures, Cold War borders, and contemporary global tensions. So this film and the concept of correspondence allows me to think about both the letter, as both a physical and conceptual object, but also about film and media as a form that especially with the rise of digital media, and even more especially post-pandemic, troubles the distinctions between the material and the immaterial characterizations of digital forms of communication. Through formal and narrative experimentation, 3 Missing Letters explores the role that mail delivery systems have played in traversing and maintaining national borders, and through their maintenance of physical routes of correspondence in the concept of the nation-state itself. Lan plus Lim's creative visualization of their research site also illuminates the dense yet fragile materiality of these systems as they depend upon the arduous physical labor of workers whose mobility, political rights, and connection to family are subject to historically contingent and shifting national borders, and upon the physical infrastructures that produce national power through environmental destruction and extraction. By linking this historical research with their own lack of access to the region, and with the rapid transition from analog to digital forms of communication during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is when this was kind of shot and edited, 3 Missing Letters provides a rich opportunity to think about the correspondences between the human and environmental materiality of postal infrastructures and the category of the nation within global Asian geopolitics. Once a central node in Himalayan trade networks linking Tibet, the Kingdom of Sikkim, and broader Asian circuits, the Nathu-La Pass was sealed following the 1962 Sino-Indian War. It was eventually reopened in 2006 for limited trade, marking a partial reactivation of these routes, but under highly controlled conditions that tether movement to state-sanctioned economic exchange. permits, checkpoints, and designated trade marts, formalized circulation while also producing new subject positions, for example, the trader as a bureaucratically legible identity that can be strategically inhabited. As anthropologist Tina Harris writes in her book Geographical Diversions, Tibetan Trade and Global Transactions, the question of who can cross over the Natula border from the Indian side is at the moment limited to business people with residency in the state of Sikkim who hold special trading permits. But she notes that when the border finally reopened in 2006, many people impersonated traders in order to see family members they had been separated from for over 40 years. Unable to cross the border due to their status as foreign nationals, Lin and Lan's on-site filming occurred on the Indian side of the pass in Sikkim, a heavily militarized border zone whose environment is also in constant flux as a result of monsoon-driven landslides and the growth of mineral extraction industries. The artists' inability to visit their main research site, which was compounded with the COVID-19 global pandemic that shut down all travel, led them to lean more heavily into speculative modes of inquiry and an emphasis on the spaces beyond and between empirically based knowledges and solid geographies. So this is just one of the, the clips I'm showing are from the film itself, and this is from a YouTube, very poor resolution YouTube representation of the space that had to kind of stand in for the actual filming. The film's narration is structured through an epistolary frame, which takes the form of 3 undelivered and missing letters. These letters are inspired by an historical incident in which inventor Stephen Smith launched an experimental mail rocket off India's Sagar Island in 1934. The rocket blew apart mid-flight, and its contents were scattered on the earth below. While the majority of the 143 letters were retrieved, 3 were never recovered, and 3 missing letters, the film speculatively reconstructs these lost messages. And I say reconstructs in quotation marks because they never actually existed in the first place. Or they did, but the ones that we see are not the real ones. So the first letter is from the Indian inventor and dental surgeon Stephen Smith, detailing his plans for the rocket mail system and his dreams for the potential of this new mail system for humanitarian projects, as well as his plans to add cameras to his rocket, linking this enhanced visibility with a notion of freedom for colonial subjects. He writes, quote, "The veil from above is what the lowly man covets from his superior. The lesser nation under the heel of its colonial master longs for this bird's eye view. One day I will see from above, and such vision will elevate me." The second letter is from the Assistant Deputy Director General of the Post Office of India to the Office of the Director General of the Post Office, the Foreign Post Department. Sorry, it's a very long, complicated title. I think I wrote it down wrong. 2 very long, complicated titles. It provides a brief history of mail service to Tibet by way of India, drawn from records from 1907 to 1933. Due to its political status, Tibet was never a member of the Universal Postal Union, the specialized agency of the United Nations established in 1874. And as the letter states, quote, "Tibetans have no recognized postal system of their own. The temporary post offices in Tibet have been opened mainly for the purpose of serving the British trade agent and his escort of native troops quartered in Tibet." The letter details the long delivery times and delays for items sent from abroad to addresses in Tibet as a result of this kind of the way that it falls outside of pre-colonial and colonial systems of mail delivery. Although they are all based on archival research and historical documents and facts, it is significant that the 3 letters were all imagined, never actually written, and never received. The third letter is to the running postman of Natula, who was the original inspiration for the film, and is written and narrated by the filmmakers Lin and Lam. They acknowledge that this is an impossible letter that will never reach him, not only because it is from the future and because the person they are writing to has died, but because as a mail carrier, quote, "your cardinal prohibition is not to read the mail." They detail their visit to Natula and their attempts to cross the border, but because they are foreign nationals, they are stalled in the border zone where, quote, "we watch migrant workers break stones and yak herders play soccer in the rain." This is one of the scenes where the artists use rotoscope animation as a way of giving visual and material shape to inaccessible histories and geographies, in addition to the form of the absent or undelivered letter. The film introduces this technique partially by rotoscoping single figures in the landscape and then animating them. So I want to focus on this kind of moment of stasis, which is given form both visually and auditorially by the most basic form of embodied labor, which is these migrant women literally breaking rocks by hand in order to make gravel that then gets used in the construction of these kind of infrastructure projects. In the final scene, the migrant workers in the landscape become fully animated. A dump truck drops a load of rocks, and the dust is transformed into stylized clouds that resemble the clouds from Tankar, Tibetan religious paintings with roots in India, China, Central Asia, Nepal, and Kashmir. The clouds, which also transform from black and white to color, evoke histories of cultural transmission across borders, as well as natural elements that can travel without the constraints of human-made borders. Through its speculative use of impossible letters and the transformation of documentary realism through animation, the film materializes otherwise intangible dynamics of geopolitical systems, capturing how subjectivities are formed through infrastructures that both enable and constrain movement. Film and video offers distinctive forms of correspondence and imagination that illuminate these contradictions, enabling viewers to achieve Smith's longed-for bird's-eye view beyond physical constraints and borders, even as they reveal the ways that their own possibilities for representation are produced by and entangled within these same systems. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. In fact, just one comment on it. I'm shocked that they recovered 143 letters, only 3 were lost. Given the way things work in India, that's a miracle. But anyway, so I was saying that's... okay, our final presenter is Alicia Elizabeth Cherian, is an anthropologist whose research asks how racially marginalized groups inhabit the social, the material, and affective geographies of Asian cities. Her current project, Discordant Harmonies, Everyday Life in the Racial City-State, explores the social, sensorial, and convivial textures of the lived experience of race in Singapore, a society governed by explicit racecraft and shaped by legacies of Indian indentured and Indian convict labor. She holds a PhD in Anthro from Stanford University and is currently a faculty fellow at Experimental Humanities and Social Engagement Program at NYU. And she'll be speaking, this is the title, Cowardice in Motion, Routes of Belonging Across Tamil, Singapore, and Malaysia. Alicia.
So just to begin by echoing what everybody else has been saying today, which is just a massive thank you to all who are involved in putting this symposium together, especially to Crystal and Tina and Amita. So this here is a video of a friend of mine carrying kavadi in Singapore for the Hindu South Indian festival of Thaipusam. Now, this video centers on my friend as an individual participating in this ritual practice. However, kavadi carriers, including my friend here, often emphasize to me how collective and social this ritual actually is. And it's precisely that I'm going to be talking about today, exploring how the materiality of the kavadi, particularly this version of the kavadi that you see here, and the material requirements of kavadi carrying mobilize groups of devotees, both along local religious procession routes, but also, crucially for this symposium, across the Singapore-Malaysia border. So Thaipusam, as well as Masimagam, Chitrai Purnami, Pangani Uttaram, and Kartigai are all annual Tamil Hindu festivals in celebration of Lord Murugan, a South Indian deity who is especially prominent among formerly indentured Tamil communities across the Indian Ocean and Bay of Bengal worlds because of his associations with being kind of anti-caste and egalitarian. And two of those places where he's particularly popular are Singapore and Malaysia. So during these festivals, devotees carry either palkudams or milk pots or kavadis in a barefoot procession to fulfill vows and in thanksgiving. The ritual comes to its conclusion once the devotee reaches the end of the procession at a temple, and their offerings of milk are taken by the priests and poured over the deity. Now, kavadis are these portable shrines that can range from simple bamboo rods that are carried over devotees' shoulders to more elaborate structures as tall as a grown man, anchored to the devotee's body either through a belt, as you can see here, but also through all sorts of piercings that both hold the kavadi in place but also are really integral to this act of devotion. So as you can see, kavadis can be incredibly complex, but also large and heavy structures. And assembling them and disassembling them requires anywhere between 2 to 6 people. One kavadi carrier, who I call Balamuragesh, one of my informants, is a Tamil Singaporean man in his early 40s. And he once described this process to me as a sort of family affair for him, his cousins, and his uncles. And here I quote, "It's actually like a factory. You have to be of a certain age to be the one to tie the peacock feathers together. Normally, that's the younger kids, the primary school kids. Then the teenagers are the ones who get to do the small structures with their screws, and then the young adults can put the big structure together." But he also stressed that the most technical job that must be learned and honed over time is piercing. So palkudam carriers and kavadi carriers are oftentimes pierced at least between their eyebrows or also through their tongues or through their cheeks, as well as with skewers and hooks sometimes all over their bodies. But the most advanced form of piercing is when the kavadi is not only resting on the kavadi carrier's torso, but is also held in place by 4 rods that are pierced vertically through the kavadi carrier's abdomen. My friend from the video that I showed in the first slide was carrying one of these kavadis. Now, the piercers have to know how to do this without causing any bleeding, but also to make sure that the kavadi sits well on the devotee's body throughout the procession. So the physical load of the kavadi, which represents the debt bondage between the devotee and the deity, can weigh anywhere from 40 kilograms to 70 kilograms, which I believe is over 100 pounds. And this necessitates a group of people following each kavadi carrier. As you can see here, this is the route for the Thaipusam festival as it's celebrated in Singapore. It's only a 3.2 kilometer walk from Perumal Temple to Tank Road Temple, but that 3.2 kilometers with the crowds ends up being about 4 to 6 hours sometimes. And so you have this group of loved ones who's following you, and they might be singing and dancing to keep the kavadi carrier's spirits up on what is an incredibly hot and strenuous walk. They also will carry a stool and some water in case the kavadi carrier needs to rest at any point. And they act like spotters in case the kavadi carrier falls or faints. So they're always ready to catch them, steady them, and to help them back up. So these are the material demands that require collective participation in the ritual of kavadi carrying. And this is, and this is specific to every time somebody carries kavadi at a festival in each place, at each temple itself, in Singapore or in Malaysia. But what I want to focus on is how it's common practice amongst kavadi carriers in Singapore to also carry kavadi in Malaysia. Because they're turning to, and I argue here, Malaysia as a sort of cultural hinterland. Now, Singapore and Malaysia were historically part of several shared geopolitical formations, both in the pre-colonial era, into the colonial era, and even for a couple of years in the post-colonial era. And even after both nation-states' independence, the border itself remains fairly porous for both Malaysian and Singaporean citizens. And both countries are also home to historical and significant South Indian populations, very much second-class citizens on both sides of the border, but also with kith and kin networks that span both countries. And as such, while part of the reason Tamil Singaporean Kavadi carriers travel to Malaysia is because regulations in Malaysia are much looser, the atmosphere in Malaysia is much livelier, and certain temples around Malaysia present different challenges. Like, for instance, the Thaipusam route in Singapore is fairly flat, whereas the route in Kuala Lumpur, for example, up to Batu Caves, culminates in climbing over 200 steps to reach the temple. But also because Malaysia is often configured as a sort of motherland, where devotees' parents, grandparents, and other extended family members were either born, had lived, or continue to live. One expert piercer who I talked to, who I call Velu, for instance, travels between Singapore and Johor Bahru twice each Thaipusam within about a 36-hour period to help pierce at a temple in Johor Bahru, because there just aren't that many folks there who are well-versed in the kinds of Kavadi piercing that he knows. And he does this simply because his mother was Indian-Malaysian. Another informant of mine travels to Penang to carry for Chitrai Purnami in honor of his uncle, who was from Penang and who carried at the Penang Waterfall Hilltop Temple while he was still alive. This informant explained to me what such an endeavor entails, that he first has to call the guy who pierces for him to make sure that he can come. Then he calls all of his friends who help him put together his kavadi and take his kavadi off, and then his loved ones who accompany him on his kavadi procession itself. He described his last trip saying that there were about 20 people who came with him. These were his family, his friends, as well as other kavadi carriers who accompanied him by carrying palkudam this time, just so that they could focus on him, on piercing him, and making sure that they were there to steady him while he was carrying the kavadi. So to quickly sum up with this, I think, minute that I have left, without discounting the more than human and the spiritual layers to kavadi carrying, this paper focused on the materiality of the kavadi as a ritual mobile object, which is moved by the devotee who carries it, but it is also an object that sets into motion a whole host of people as well. As such, we can see how kavadis become diasporic vehicles, not just between South Asia and Southeast Asia, but within Southeast Asia itself, highlighting how global Asias can be understood not only oriented around singular points of origin, but also through regional entanglements that trace, but are also forged through these routes of kavadi carrying that re-enliven and stitch together these historic geographies of Indian Singaporean, and if we take a wider lens, Indian Malayan movement and belonging. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Maybe I'll make a couple of comments, opening comments, then let's open it up for some questions. Of course, you would have noted the fascinating play of material and immaterial, between human and more than human in each of these papers. And I'm elaborating just from their abstract. So this makes me really excited about the longer version of any of this work. And each of these papers look at nation, region, and globe, and the borders between them, making and unmaking of it. And specifically valuable things, and in some ways they're mere encasings or they're kind of invaluable covers. And finally, what struck me about these papers was that this very creative rethinking under conditions of kind of a re-emergent, especially India and China in the world economy today. It reminds me very clearly, of course, of Andre Gunder Frank's book, Reorient, and how to think about centers and margins, and each of these papers kind of engage with the question of culture as origin and culture as destination. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and open it up to some comments and questions from you to the presenters.
Thank you for the really fabulous papers. I have an observation that is for Alicia, but I guess it can also extend to the rest of the panels. I'm particularly observing because I'm sitting at the back, and just the moment when we registered what the cavity was and what it meant to be wearing one, and the debt and the symbol, and I'm just, especially your paper really highlighted like the viscerality of this object being made human or part of the human, but also the human kind of being both vulnerable but also invulnerable at the same time, and how that extension of the body via this object, literally and metaphorically, becomes like a wider umbrella that extends to a kind of more than human sociality within the networks of kinship. And just thinking about the potential of sensing this object, and also thinking along the lines of the rest of the objects on this panel, like letters and tea. And specifically, I know it's not part of this syllabus, but thinking through Anne Cheng's ornamentalism and the idea of like encrusted personhood and this boundary of subjecthood and objecthood being transgressed or deliberately kind of broken, and I'm wondering, I guess, if you have a response to that. And it's just really amazing. I'm also Singaporean, just hearing about Singaporean scholarship, but also the dedication to the kind of site that you have. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that, for such a generous observation, and also such a great question. I think immediately what it makes me think of is how the cavity kind of, the line between the cavity and the devotee's body in some ways is, if we're just at first glance is quite clear, right? But then when we really start to think about what's going on here and how interrelated or how kind of enmeshed both are when we're thinking about the cavity as this object that is moved, but also as this object that's doing a lot of moving itself, because it is this kind of mobile altar, right? So you might have a painting of the god, you might have a statue that represents the god, or other, some other, another kind of object in there that's supposed to be the god. So you're kind of, in some ways, transporting the god as well, right? The whole time through the cavity. At the same time, there are cases where devotees, through the, through carrying the cavity itself and through everything that's going on. This is, again, an incredibly heavy structure, and you do have all of these kind of skewers kind of poking into you. Sometimes there is like a trance-like state that's reached, where then the devotee is sometimes embodying the deity itself. And so then the question of which is a vehicle, which is the medium, it all gets really interesting and entangled. Yeah, thank you.
This is maybe adding on to the question, the previous question, but as I was listening to the papers, I was really struck by this idea of surface in all of your presentations, the decoration on the tea caddy or a letter, right? The idea behind a letter, of course, is that you only see the address and the contents are not available to the mail carrier, or the cavity as and the kind of the way in which it's encrusted, as the previous questioner was saying. So I was wondering if you could talk about maybe that interplay between, I don't know if you want to call it surface and depth, or the idea that there is something that is not accessible, right? That the surface calls forth but doesn't actually ever reveal. So yeah, thank you.
I can take that, but I actually want to answer it sort of by way of the first question, which is to sort of not think so much about surface and depth, but think more about the embodied and the disembodied, or the material and the immaterial. We were at lunch before we came here, we were kind of talking about what are some of the questions that organize this larger special issue, and one of them was kind of what constitutes a moving object, and how do we think about the objects that we're talking about as moving objects. And for me, what's useful about thinking about film and my choice of this particular film is because it creates a kind of binary that it then breaks down between the postal system, which is the most kind of embodied form of delivery, mail delivery system. And we see the way, in the film, the way in which it is, this is the most extreme form of what a letter carrier has to go through, but also the way that it's interrupted or both enabled and also restricted through all of these, very obvious geopolitical, environmental, physical, kinds of structures and infrastructures. The film actually makes a sort of oblique reference that I know that the filmmakers have talked about in more detail elsewhere about the way in which this was made during the COVID pandemic, which was a time when, of course, the sort of differential vulnerability of certain kinds of workers to disability and death, became really apparent, including postal workers and these sort of essential workers. So even in the U.S., the postal service, the sort of physicality of their labor and their humanness, was made really apparent. So that you have the postal system on the one hand, and then you have one of the other things that the COVID pandemic really accelerated was the kind of loss of the postal system, and the move to virtual forms of communication and correspondence. This was a time when, even during that election, the postal system was being threatened as an institution in the U.S. And we have now really kind of embraced these more, seemingly immaterial forms of correspondence that are often talked about as forms of green technology, right? We're saving trees, and it's this immaterial kind of process. But of course, the environment was coming back to life during the pandemic, right? Then it was fake news, but like dolphins in the Venice canals, et cetera. But of course, there's all this focus on AI and data centers and everything has made completely clear, has completely given the lie to that narrative that digital media is immaterial and does not have, environmental and human consequences and kind of impact and involvement on human labor and human bodies. So, I think I've sort of lost the thread of the question, but I think to me, I'm really interested in the way in which these two seemingly opposite forms of correspondence and communication, one very material, very physical and very embodied, and one disembodied, actually are not that separate. And both of them, if we look at them together, can help us understand not just their materiality, but also how that materiality is kind of entangled in all of these other historical, geographical, geopolitical, forms of relation.
Thank you for the question. I think the first question can be answered better by already been answered by these two brilliant panelists. About the surface and depth, I haven't really thought about T-chest from the surface and depth, but Obviously, it has been often understood that chests themselves are surface for the tea. When we think of a tea as a kind of a unit of commodity, there is either aluminum foil or tin canister or these sort of wooden boxes. So it's sort of interesting to think about it as surface and depth. And what you're indicating about this decoration is a very interesting phenomenon because that was originally part of this Chinese practice, and then we don't exactly know why Chinese tea chests were decorated, but that's something that cannot be completely explained by efficiency alone, right? Because a lot of the crates that we often think of are very crude surfaces and then untreated, like cheap materials and things like that. But exactly that transformation from these decorated, elaborate surface and towards this porous and easily rottable materiality was exactly what happened in India as this kind of churning out of these boxes happened. And that also created a lot of these kind of material problems for the chest itself, actually, not just on the surface. So in a way, this kind of a disappearance of the decoration, surface decoration, is an indicator of this kind of changing materiality of the tea chest or package.
Can I raise, unless there's a question, a related point here? Eve's work, your work, kind of beautifully points to this question of, in some ways, letters move, letter carriers cannot move. Some of it is, right? So in some ways, the other side of a movable object is probably an immovable person, okay? And that's partly the nature of global capitalism, where in some ways capital moves, information moves, stuff moves. There are lots of barriers to people moving, okay? So in some ways, this movability, immovability kind of are paired together. For me, that was kind of a good reminder. And I think in the last paper was the sense of circulation, a locality, and yet some relationship to other real and imagined places, okay? And it reminded me, and maybe I invite you a little bit to think about it, in, I think it was in Graves of Tarim. It was Enseng Ho. I was startled when he makes that claim really early in the book. He says, diasporas are about long enduring absences. Transnationalism is about an insistent presence. Okay, we are constantly communicating, texting, digital conversation. He makes the argument that real diasporas have to deal with long absences. Okay, so any thought on this question of movable objects, maybe immovable bodies? I'm just putting it on one side of it. And this question of the capacity, this Enseng Ho construction of what he thinks a real diaspora is, and of course, in his case, he's talking about the Hadramati Yemenis returning to Yemen or not returning to Yemen, and this question of the diaspora is built around absence, while transnationalism is built around an insistent presence. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that both of those questions make me think of two kind of different but maybe related things. The first one, in going back to this question that we were talking about earlier of what is or is not a movable or a moving object or a movable object, also made me then think of, if we're thinking about the moving object and the immobile person, also where the object and the person collapse, not just in terms of what I talked about earlier with the cavity being but really when thinking about, for instance, how an enslaved person was a commodity was an object that was being transported, you know, I mean, in those ways as well, right? And then in my context, what I'm looking at, if we think of indentured labor as this thing that was supposed to be different, this thing that was supposed to be amongst free people who could, you know, consent to a contract, and that kind of mobility that didn't quite function in those ways, that's what that makes me think about as well, is when does especially for this panel where the people moving the objects, you know, the person is there in the title of the panel itself, what separates an object from a person? When does a person become an object? Is the person being immobile? You know, I mean, there's all sorts of questions there. Sorry, that wasn't an answer, but more of just a string of thoughts. But with the second question, that's something that I'm thinking about in my larger work, where I argue that especially South Indian communities in Singapore and Malaysia are no longer quite oriented towards South Asia. And so then if I'm thinking about them as diaspora or whether this is a transnational community, whether this is a diasporic community, particularly for these really historic communities, it's like Singapore and Malaysia have their own wells of culture, of practice that are rooted in the kind of material, you know, the material landscape that kind of exists there, but also all sorts of objects and food and all these things that are already available within Singapore and Malaysia itself. And so then I wonder then how then to think about diaspora and transnationalism when it's rooted, both of the words, you know, within that landscape too.
Fantastic.
Sorry, those were
that's
not
good.
answers, but thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it also makes me think about time and the way in which these kinds of changes in communication and in transportation and in mobility really are dependent upon and also shape ideas about diasporic time. So, you know, if you're thinking about forms of you know, delivery that are dependent upon, you know, that are becoming obsolete, right? Like the letter, and are being replaced by other forms of communication. First of all, there's a difference in kind of just waiting, right? The time that it takes for someone to write a letter, send a letter, receive a letter, or a package, you know, or are you waiting for someone to bring, you know, the balikbayan box, or, you know, so the suitcase full of goods, or whatever it might be, versus sending a text or an Instagram message or something. But there are also, I think, for different generations, there are different kinds of associations with those different technologies, right? So I've written about, you know, VHS video tape, for example, right, as an object that was sent, and actually Lana has made work about that as well, or you know, the airmail letter, again, which has certain kind of very affective, you know, and kind of nostalgic.
It still gives me goosebumps to see, because all my letters when I wrote home are those airmail blue letters around it, and a very different affective. And I think you're absolutely right about it. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt
I
you.
mean, the weight of the paper, right? The sound of it, the physicality of it, all of those things.
The fragility of it, you know? And so, no, excellent, yeah.
From my perspective, I think mobility and immobility is also related to the visibility
Okay.
of the entities that we're asking about, because people did move. It's just that their travel wasn't charted.
I see.
And also so from my perspective, this is a commodity, right? Commodity, especially the global capital's commodity, and their movements are very well charted because there is a cost, there is, you know, supply chain, and there are a lot of stakeholders. Whereas this workers, they actually moved to so many different work sites, but their labor was often, I mean, they did have earnings and salaries and stuff, but it wasn't really understood as embodied knowledge or kind of skillful practice. Therefore, their registration is oftentimes their wages. But if we actually trace these artisans, they moved to various places and then they produced many various different kinds of things. So these tea boxes are one type of things, but they also produce like furniture, they build stuff and they repair chips and etc. So it's just kind of, perhaps the movement of bodies and movement of objects are not always aligned, and we might have to look through different lenses or ask different questions to chart them.
Excellent point there. And your work made me also think, in some ways, I'm assuming in the longer piece, you will be thinking about nodal points, anchor points, routing points, right? In some, there's a geography of movement and friction. So let's call flow and friction, right? And the inevitable nature of it. So that's one set. And because I'm in food studies, what I'm really interested in is this question, in your case, of cooking, feeding, as this community of workers move. Because we have seen, I think it is in Aslanian's work amongst the Armenians, where he says, some things move and other things don't. And he says, young men move, merchants move, credit moves, information moves, but he says women don't in his network. So in some ways, home cooking doesn't, okay? So street foods, market cuisine is much more portable, but home cooking doesn't. So some forms of it, your workers kind of have this kind of desire to know what were they eating, what were they cooking, and what were the modes of, and I think Aslanian, who also says, women in home cooking, old men return. They don't set out, they return. And then, of course, there's a question of whether priests move or not. So in your case, an example, say, of a node and modes of, when I gesture towards cooking, I'm meaning inhabitation. What are the spots that they inhabit and how? Any examples?
Yeah, so for example, Kolkata has one of the oldest Chinatowns.
And according to Bengalis, the best Chinese food, including in China.
So I visited the Chinatown a couple of years ago, and then this is more of my own personal anecdote, but what was very interesting, I mean, this is also historically recorded because, Chinese, at least when they migrated in the 19th century, they were pork eaters.
Yep.
They ate a lot of pork. But the local Bengali Muslims, right, they couldn't eat pork. So therefore, there was some line of the marriage when a lot of male Chinese went to India, and then some of them settled down and had, like married and etc. So that the food became actually caused tension about their marriage life. Unfortunately, I hadn't really looked that much into that particular direction in my archival research, but then based on my experience, so when I visited the Chinese restaurant, so the Chinese themselves, they're like third or fourth generation right now, and they don't cook themselves. Their chefs are all Muslims.
I see.
Interestingly enough, so they cook without tasting it, following simply a recipe given to them. And I mean, there's a whole sort of question of palate and then, recreation of this taste that you inherit from your parents and things like that. It's coming into play here, I think. I mean, this is not really my domain, but I think it's such an interesting question. Yeah,
of course. I mean, we South Asians are champions of the first thing we say when we see a new thing to eat is, don't eat it. We are the first people in the world to say, don't touch that, don't eat it, which of course is structured around long histories of caste production, etc.
And the conversation we've been having is making me think about how we set the symposium up, and maybe is an opportunity for us to maybe rethink like what it is that we're doing. In that, So when we first started to think about how to set this up, we started with the premise that oftentimes when people are talking about mobility, they tend to focus on human subjects moving. And so we were trying to sort of create this space to think about materiality, but in the words that have been coming up, viscerality, embodiment, insistent presence, which led Alicia to say, hey, we've created this weird bifurcation, right? It's like objects moving people and then people moving objects, which sets up a circumstance where people and objects can't be the same thing.
I see.
So I wonder if like all of this conversation is an invitation for us to maybe rethink the conditions that we established for this symposium. So what would it mean to sort of like think about materiality through viscerality, for example, right? Like what would it mean for us to start thinking about moving objects by not actually hewing to the distinction that the two panel titles suggest, which is people are not objects and objects are not people. If we actually sort of like lean into this observation that Alicia made about like, okay, maybe these things collapse into themselves, does that merely instantiate like the centrality of the human, which is like the point that we were trying to sort of move away from? Or is there a way for us to actually, having the conversations that we've had from the morning's panel and then today, to now think about the combination of people and objects in ways that actually create a different space for thinking about materiality? I guess so that's my question.
It also reminds me, what happens when people swallow objects, right? Which is, of course, what eating is, right? Is this a question of it, powerful, yeah?
I mean, I just to make things even more complicated, when you say moving objects, of course, and I think about letters, and film and video as well, I have to think about the affective in dimension, you know, sort of objects that move us emotionally, and you know, movement not just physically, spatially, but also in these other ways.
I think one way of, I mean, my kind of comprehension of the second panel, and I do think that it also played in the first panel as well, is this various forms of embodiments, but also especially knowledge that is constructed out of the body object or human material interaction. I think cavity is a really great example that kind of embodied the sort of eco-knowledge of the terrain, where the Mary carriers deliver mail, or the failure of that is also an indication of this systematic Willian assemblage. I mean, a lot of anthropologists have sort of talked about it. I think that makes a lot of sense.
In trying to think about this question, I've been trying to also think about, okay, when is an object moving but a person is, but people are not involved? And then to steal an answer from the first panel, it then made me think about the environment and the natural world, or, you know, even that division, right, human and natural world. But yeah, to think about that, and I don't have an answer, but to wonder if that kind of gives us somewhere to think about, how objects can move and be moved by forces that are not at least immediately human in their design, or in their if the entity doing the moving of the object is not human, and what do we do with it? Maybe is that an opening, or maybe just a black hole? I don't know.
You know what struck me in this is, as you were articulating it and you're responding, in all three of your papers, there's wood and paper, and it is something about that relationship between humans and plants, in fact, okay? And it's fascinating, it just struck me right now that there's a trace of plant lives in all your papers. And yours, I was in fact thinking about, and feel free to elaborate or ignore it, is why sugarcane? Because I think sugarcane is part of this, what is carried ritually, okay? And in all three, there are these traces of a natural environment, humans moving, also carrying things that are coming out of course, in your case, the division you made, just a heuristic for now, right? Which is human and other life forms, in this case, plant, and of course, plant is what eventually becomes paper. And so this kind of fascinating, or let me put it like this, plants haunt all your papers.
So I wanted to build on the last question that kind of asked about the constructs of the session by thinking about this question of objecthood. And so I appreciated that each one of these papers dealt with fugitive objects, objects that exist in a certain temporality, but are not necessarily preserved in collections. So these tea boxes, Kyoungjin, you mentioned, aren't collected in the ways that you've used eBay. Eve, you spoke wonderfully about absences, but also the ways that filmmaking can recreate through imaginative artistic practice these absences. And then Alicia, you spoke about living tradition and the ways that you have informants that you collaborate with in these this research. And so it's a research-based question, but did any of you enter these projects thinking about issues that you couldn't answer in an archive or through discussions with communities? And in what ways did your project evolve through these absences?
So in thinking about methods, this paper that I gave in the contribution is the one part of my project that is where I didn't get to do participant observation, which was, such a cornerstone, right, of anthropology. And in my larger project, which is on the lived experience of race, I did 28 months of fieldwork in Singapore. But because that was September 2020 to December 2022, there were no festivals that I could attend, either because the government, especially at the beginning, wasn't allowing these festivals, particularly because of, or the rationale was because of the piercings, which then could cause, a spread through flu, all sorts of things, to the festivals being highly restricted for just the people who are signed up to carry themselves. And so there wasn't space for me to go. So this is the one part of my research where I had to rely purely on interviews and anecdotes and conversations, which is so different, at least for me methodologically, and then was particularly a challenge, but also interesting when I think about how this was supposed to be about materiality, right? And I didn't ever get to actually, touch a cavity. Not that, but you know what I mean? Like I was not in the physical presence of a cavity at all in any of this research, which was, it's something that I hope to do in the future. But yeah, but I also wonder if that then helped, especially because I could tell when I was talking to people, the fact that they weren't able to do it, or when they were able to do it, they had to do it in this way that was so different from how they typically had practiced it and now have gone back to practicing it, that certain things were heavy on their mind. So for instance, the social aspect of it, right? That was kind of sterilized through all these social distancing measures. And so similarly, maybe the materiality is top in my mind because it was so materially absent in my research.
Can I ask one clarifying question on that sense? You have a line in your abstract, you say, partly Murugan works because of a certain kind of idealized masculinity, right? Are these things also framed within a kind of a masculine project?
Do you, like my project? Or
cavities. Are they seen as, in some ways, masculine objects of veneration or masculine ways of expressing devotion? Are they? I don't know.
Yeah.
Simply.
Absolutely. I mean, there are women, and I'm sure, you know, non-binary folks, I just haven't met any, but there are some women who carry kavadi, but they're very much points of contention.
Okay.
Because it's supposed to be it's supposed to be something that traditionally or historically only men do. And along with, so it's this interesting thing where on the one hand it's widely popular, arguably more so in Singapore and Malaysia than it is in Tamil Nadu, particularly because Murugan is supposed to have all of these kind of anti-caste, egalitarian notions, and because predominantly the Tamil Hindu community in Malaysia and Singapore, partly because of indenture, but also just partly because of how migration was happening for centuries, that these are communities from historically working class, historically lower caste or Dalit, you know, communities. And so this is a really popular festival in that sense. But then also there's all these ways in which it's highly gendered, and not in a kind of, there's equality and difference, but gendered in a very uneven way as well. Yeah.
Let's go back to that question from behind, from back, Eve and Kyoungjin.
Yeah, thank you for that question. This is one of those awkward moments where the filmmakers that I'm talking about are sitting right here. Probably going to give a much more beautiful answer than I can, and so feel free to jump in. But I can say, so I have a sort of two-part answer to that. One is sort of on their behalf, or you know, in the context of this particular film, which is that you know, it's based on a lot of archival, you know, research, and the, you know, archives are engaged, but also really inspired by a lot of, you know, the inability to, you know, go to their site, or to, you know, the figure, the original postman who was kind of inspired the whole project, you know, turns out to have passed away by the time, you know, they were able to get to the site, and they were not able to interview him. And so there's all this, you know, there are all these barriers and kind of lack of evidence or data that then become a kind of, you know, structuring, you know, inspiration for the film, and the way that it kind of opens up these other questions that for me are very interesting, because I'm coming to it really from these questions about archival absences as one of the central questions of my work. So, you know, my book is really about film, sort of how do we do film, cinema history, in the particularly Asian American cinema history that is sort of, can be understood sort of axiomatically through not only absence, you know, archival absence and gaps, and kind of failures in many ways, but also through disintegration, decay, you know, of the objects. And so, you know, a lot of the objects that I'm really interested in are partial fragments, really decayed, deteriorated artifacts, or non-extant work altogether. And it's a way of, you know, the questions I ask are sort of how can we not kind of mourn that as a loss, but actually see it as a provocation and as an invitation to not only join with, you know, all kinds of scholars who are already doing this work in kind of critical fabulation, right? And kind of thinking about working against, you know, working with the archives against themselves, but also to think about it in terms of the materiality of the objects, that to have a decayed fragment is not just, you know, you're not just looking at its loss, you're looking at something that's really rich with a different kind of data, right, and different kinds of history. And what are the sort of methods that we can kind of proliferate and inspire because of that, as opposed to yeah, just thinking about it is something that we no longer have access to. And in fact, that condition is the condition of all media, right? All media, all films and videos are constantly in a state of decay, like as are we all, right? As all everything, material is. We are all, where we are in this moment is this one moment, and in the next second our cells will have turned around and become something else. And so how can we sort of embrace that as a kind of methodological inspiration and invitation?
One quick follow-up. It made me think, I'm assuming in your longer piece, does it matter what language is being written in the letters are in? The languages of those letters? And what survives and what vanishes or becomes what is more invisible than others in your longer piece? Is it?
I have not thought about language,
Okay.
but I will now that you raised it.
So I think I'm going to echo Eve. So, I mean, from a historian's perspective, archive is never neutral, right? It's always violent. It's violent against marginalized people. So in my case, I don't want to deviate too much from the premise of this conference, but I study artisans. And artisans they work with, they talk with their bodies, right? And with their skills, they don't write necessarily. So it's very hard to find records about them in the kind of conventional historical archives. So in my perspective, objects are so precious because what they made is oftentimes, to me, sometimes the only evidence or only embodiment of their personhood. There are records about their guilds or their other communities and etc. But what I'm truly interested in, like their practice, their kind of knowledge, their environmental interactions. I think even though in these conditions of decaying and constantly losing materials like tea chests, but they're very precious for that reason. Thanks.
One related follow-up question on yours, which is again kind of inspired by this. Do any of them try to leave a mark on these objects they have made? Sometimes craftspeople will leave either a hidden signature or are those identifiable in your data?
Yeah, but that's also culturally patterned, right? Because we're not talking about artists. These are people who are mobilized in large scale and mobilized in kind of a socially distributed spaces. And so in Chinese context, there are some crafts where artisans tend to leave more marks. Like ceramics, for example, you get to see sometimes, or lacquerware, you get to see sometimes the actual maker leave their marks. But they're oftentimes more sort of, I wouldn't say high-end, but more collectible, more valuable, more aestheticizing, right? Interestingly, woodwork, a lot of them often have no marks. And yeah.
So this is an invitation, I think, if it, which you can decline, but since we have Lam and Lin, the filmmakers here, can we just open the floor to them and see their reactions to any of the terms?
This was inspired by your question, which is about like the methods that people are using, right? And so like, I think given our focus on materiality, a lot of people have really emphasized like archival work, a kind of more empirical sort of approach to knowledge, but then, you mentioned the affective, and you also mentioned that there are things that we can't know. And one of the things I was so struck by about the description of the film was that you guys employed a speculative approach. And so I would love to hear more about like the speculative approach in the film and how you use that.
Would it be good to call it speculative realism?
Sure. I mean, that's one of the reasons, or one of the ways in which we were able to continue making the work during the pandemic, and we do have a deadline. Thank you for the invitation to kind of engage with this conversation, but and also I was thinking about your provocation of immobility of objects. In fact, what I was thinking about the archive itself, that is the state. the power of the state, which is colonialism, imperialism. For us, we have done the due diligence to research in New Delhi and also Sikkim archive and found what we could. But then we also realized we need to go to London. We needed to go to the British Museum, the British Library, and also the British Postal Museum, where we actually found a lot of material,
I see.
including clues about questions about Tibetan mail. So that becomes this kind of calling the archive and thinking about power relation, humanity desires for connection, right? But that desire is supplanted or definitely is, we have to navigate the power of the state, right? So that's what I was thinking about in terms of just kind of the archive.
Just in terms of going to the British archives, that kind of speaks to your comment about language. I mean, because there was only so much we could access in the other archives in India. I mean, there was material written in English, but there was other material we couldn't access. And speculative realism, I would probably lean toward critical fabulation.
Okay, that's good.
Eve mentioned, and I think Eve really beautifully described what the work of the film was for us. And as Lantau was just saying, that actually desire really was a first impulse for the project, to thinking through what motivates people to want to be in touch, to that desire to be in touch with another is the basis of communication. So really is to the affective dimension that Eve also brought up.
I'll actually maybe continue asking the artist as well, but also Eve. I was drawn to also the last scenes where the film turns into animation. And Eve described it as the traveling clouds as a way of also describing certain intangible connections, and film also seen as something that can both capture the reality but has its own limitations. And with a lot of, I guess, like critical logistics films that try to address all the labor that goes beyond it, but still sometimes maybe what is the limitation where it fails to show the human affect, and maybe the animation was a part of it in this project, and what are the things that I guess cannot be visually translated?
Well, I think Lantau should talk about the animation a little bit with the transformation of the clouds, because that was really your
Insistence?
yes. But I will just say a little bit about what cannot be visually translated. Is that what you said? Captured. I mean, the sound work is actually very important in the piece. So there is that level of the what's audible as crossing some other kind of boundary. And sound travels and crosses boundaries in a different way than the visible. But I don't know what else to say about that at this moment.
Yeah, the cloud allows to return to traditional Tangyam paintings of Tibetan Buddhist traditions, and that's something I grew up with, being from Vietnam and raised kind of like ancestral kind of recognitions. And so that moment where we are locked down and pure actually desires, but also desperation. And I felt like the film and myself, us as maker, needed to kind of have a moment of kind of fabulation, of kind of like beyond the thing that's happening to all of us, and we do not know what's the next day, the next year would look like, right? Transcendences, yeah. So to turn the clouds into the dust become cloud that reaches beyond what we could actually humanly able to, that was really important. And that's kind of venereal work that I do think about. If there was a wish that to send forward as an artist, right? As that moment of like, this all is speculative, critical fabulation of kind of recollection and engagement with past, present, and future all at once. And that was the moment for each of the kind of moment where we couldn't do something in real life that animation allows us to kind of be wacko a little bit as an artist.
Eve, do you want to take the last bit of it? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, animation, it's literally meaning bringing to life.
Yeah.
And so it's, to me, I love thinking about animation as a artistic practice and a media practice, because it's doing so many different kinds of work for artists, because it materializes, again, in that kind of space between the material and the immaterial, and the animate and the inanimate, and the kind of affective and tangible, I guess. I don't know what the opposition would be. So theoretically, it's really important, but then it also, it's about creating a visual that doesn't exist in any other way, right? So it's moving. I mean, it really is moving a kind of imaginary space or reality into something else. So it's a great way to kind of think about how the work is engaging with these larger questions.
Lovely. Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot. And our speakers, Kyoungjin, Eve, and Alicia, thank you. It was terrific.
I am so grateful again to Tina, to the staff at APA, and to all of our speakers and moderators for just their contributions in this incredibly lively and engaging conversation, and to all of you for your questions and attention on this beautiful Friday afternoon. We have a reception, so we hope you will hang around, have some food, drink, and continue the conversation in a more informal manner. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,